The automotive industry is panicking and, frankly, bracing for a recession.
Some economists say the average imported vehicle will cost an additional $12,000.
This is going to drive the auto industry, not the overall economy, into a recession.
The 25% tariff on imported cars and trucks, combined with the newly added 25% tariff on steel and aluminum, has set off alarm bells across major automakers. The central narrative is that these tariffs will raise prices, challenge manufacturers, and slow down demand for vehicles. But how exactly is this going to unfold, and which companies are going to feel the pressure the most? Let's break it all down. Now, first, it's important to note that the auto tariffs apply to all imported vehicles and certain auto parts unless they meet specific criteria under the United States-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. Any vehicle or part that is not substantially produced in the US will be subject to the full 25% tariff. So who's going to be hit the hardest? Well, roughly 16 million cars and trucks were sold in the US during 2024, and around 45% of all vehicles sold in the US were imported. Now, every automaker is already subject to global supply dependencies, and these new tariffs will absolutely reshape pricing, sourcing, and availability across the landscape. Unless individual countries can carve out exemptions, which seems highly unlikely at the moment, these tariffs are going to have significant impacts across the sector. Now, these tariffs will clearly affect the automakers that rely on importing vehicles and parts, which is essentially every automaker. Companies like Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Toyota, Volvo, and so many more all have substantial portions of their production overseas, and they will bear the brunt from these tariffs. Currently, only Tesla, Rivian, and Lucid make their vehicles exclusively in the US. But even these electric vehicles that are American-made aren't completely insulated from these tariffs, as they too rely on international supply chains for parts and materials. Now, all of these other manufacturers produce at least a portion of their vehicles in places like Mexico, Canada, Europe, and Asia, and are often imported to the US for assembly or final sale. But even the big three, which are American companies, Ford, GM, and Stellantis, all make a portion of their vehicles outside the US and rely on international supply chains for specific parts. So as a result, these companies will see a significant increase in the cost of each vehicle they sell, and how they slice up this increase is what we're about to get into further. But here's where things get even trickier. The 25% tariff doesn't just exist in isolation. As I mentioned, it stacks on top of the already existing 25% on steel and aluminum. Automakers who import steel or aluminum for vehicle parts now face this compounded increased cost, which will push up the cost of manufacturing even further.
And Canadian manufacturers are already dealing with tariffs on steel and aluminum, piling automotive tariffs on top of that. How long before the auto sector might have to shut down?
It's not clear what the total tariff number will be for the industry, so figuring out how much runway it has is tricky. But we know that supply chains are deeply integrated, and if these hefty tariffs remain in place, then we could see assembly lines on both sides of the border shut down in a matter of 7 days.
So no matter how you spin it, profit margins will compress and prices for consumers will have to rise, even for the three companies that make their cars exclusively in the US. Because as I said, they're still sourcing parts from other countries. Now you might be wondering, will these companies be able to move production to the US to avoid these tariffs? And if not, why not? Well, it's not that simple. Building a new plant in the US is a massive and expensive undertaking. It's not just about hiring a workforce, although that is an important element too. It's about the time and cost involved. The minimum time frame to build a new plant is going to be 3 to 4 years, with the price tag of at least $3 to $4 billion. That's a significant investment, and it's not something that can be done overnight, especially when companies already have well-established supply chains in other countries. These companies also don't want to make a hasty decision, like all of a sudden shift production to the US if in a month or two the president changes his mind on tariffs, or even if the next administration isn't too keen on keeping the same tariffs that Trump enacts in place. So as you can imagine, this is a very uncertain position to be in if you're in charge of one of these auto companies. Just for example, Ford built a massive new plant in Tennessee called Blue Oval City. This was announced all the way back in 2021, and it cost them $5.6 billion. It's still not completely operational, but is expected to be by 2025. The facility consists mostly of Ford's electric vehicle pickup trucks and is expected to employ around 5,800 people. So even if other automakers wanted to replicate this idea after seeing these new tariffs, the time and money required to build new factories would put them at a serious disadvantage, especially when you factor in any delays and supply chain disruptions. But honestly, it doesn't stop there, because Trump has mentioned he wants the plants that Ford, GM, and Stellantis have outside the US, like in Canada and Mexico, to come back to the US. And that just seems highly unlikely too. Not just because of the reasons I just mentioned, but because these plants serve other sections of the world beyond the US. So while they may shift or slow down some production from these plants, they are highly unlikely to close them down and bring them to the US. Doing so would result in even more disruption to their business models.
There's paralysis amongst the auto industry in the C-suites. Why? Yes, they understand that the administration wants production brought back to the United States, but the production for vehicles is set up by region, and North America is a region, and you just can't move a plant from one country to another, have it done overnight.
So with these rising production costs, automakers will see their profit margins shrink, even as they try to maintain competitive pricing. In many cases, this will result in decreased incentives, less discounting, fewer promotions, and fewer deals for consumers. These incentives have long been a staple for new vehicle sales strategies. From rebates to low-interest financing, automakers have used them to entice buyers and move inventory quickly. However, with margins under pressure, these types of incentives will become less common, making it more difficult for consumers to get the deals that they're used to, which will then in turn mean less cars being sold for these companies. Now, analysts predict that the average price of a new vehicle could increase by as much as $15,000 or as low as $4,000. As you can tell, these ranges vary widely. While some automakers may attempt to absorb some of these costs, they certainly will not absorb all of it. Others will likely pass them directly onto consumers in an effort to protect their bottom lines. For the average American car buyer, this means not only paying more for newer vehicles, but also many experts agree that this will drive up the price of used car prices as well. While it's important to note, used car prices won't be subject to these tariffs, they could be in an indirect way, like through any new parts or service costs associated with repairs. And this aspect makes all of this much, much worse for consumers, as used car prices have only very recently declined from their elevated prices, but are still up significantly since the beginning of the pandemic. Now, it's unclear at this time exactly what will happen to the used car market, because a lot of this is contingent on how the consumer and the car dealerships decide to react to these changes in price and supply. But the broader question here is whether these tariffs could trigger a recession in the auto industry. While it's unlikely that the entire economy will slip into a downturn due to these tariffs alone, the auto sector is likely to face a significant contraction this year. Higher vehicle prices and reduced incentives could dampen consumer demand, leading to a slowdown in sales. The slowdown could lead to layoffs, plant closures, and a reduction in new investment from these companies. Now, these same companies will be forced to make tough decisions about where to allocate resources, and it's very possible that some smaller automakers or those less able to pivot could struggle to survive. For the auto industry, this is a critical moment. The ability to adapt to these new realities will determine how companies navigate these difficult waters. But for consumers, it's likely that the days of generous incentives and the already elevated vehicle prices are about to get even more out of reach. Now, if you enjoyed this video and you want to learn about the interesting dynamics at play for DoorDash, well, I covered it in this video here. Go ahead and check it out next. Thanks for watching.